How's it going, everybody? This is Delightful Eon here. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about my opinion on God, or one of my many opinions, I should say, because it's sort of an evolving concept that I've been coming up with over time. I understand that the topic of God is a very contentious issue. Feel free to comment down below if you have your own opinion, or you agree with me, or you disagree with parts of what I'm saying. I'm all ears. I'm definitely willing to learn more and hear different perspectives. But I thought I would talk a little bit about my sort of perspective on God. If you like this kind of stuff, the more philosophical and interesting type of questions about life, maybe consider checking out some of my other videos. Maybe hit the subscribe button if you like this kind of stuff. So what I personally believe God is, well, let me talk a little bit about why I believe what I believe and why I think there's a little bit of a logical framework here. So I believe that in the beginning, God was all that was. And when I say the beginning, I mean it could technically stretch infinitely far into the past, because God was all that is. God always was, in a sense. And the reason I believe that God always was is because I don't believe it's possible to go from absolute nothingness to something. I don't believe it's possible to go from absolute nothingness, meaning no math, no quantum physics, no quarks, no vacuum, no atoms, no anything, to something. So God, which I believe God is made of light, that's what I believe God is made of, always was. And so that's the first important concept to get out of the way, is that God always existed, but God chose to generate basically infinite future potentials for God to explore. But here's the caveat. Here's the interesting kind of twist to this that I think a lot of people, I don't want to say they miss because it's my opinion, but a lot of people I think have a kind of the typical explanation of what God is. But in my view, God was infinitely alone in the beginning. And a lot of people kind of get confused about that. Well, God's all-powerful. How could God be infinitely alone? Well, let's say in the beginning that God was a little, ball of light. But the thing is, if God was all that is, even though God was a ball of light, God would still be infinite, right? Because I define infinity as being all that is. There's nothing else. So even in God's most simple form, God was infinite. But on the flip side of that, God was also infinitely alone. There was no one else to share anything with. Everything that God was exploring within, or anything that God was creating, let's say God created another entity outside of itself, that would just be another version of God. God would know all the possible potentials that entity could explore. God would know every thought pulsating through that entity, every single thing that entity could do in the future, every possible future that entity could explore. God would know it all because God is everything. So that's what I believe. That's kind of my interpretation. God was infinitely alone, but also infinitely powerful, because, again, infinitely powerful relative to what? Well, relative to itself, because God was all that was. I know it's a little bit of a mind game, but if you think about that, it makes sense, I think. So what God decided to do is basically God wanted to trick itself into believing that there were other beings out there. So God, and what I believe happened is that there is a certain rotation, there is a certain twister, there is a certain pattern, there is a certain spin that somehow perfectly encapsulates the prior state, but also generates a new potential. So basically what I believe is that God was this basically infinitely flat piece of light spanning infinitely far. And as that light, God voluntarily or involuntarily, I'm still not sure whether God actually chose to exist or not, or whether I'm not entirely sure on the fine details of this, obviously, it's just a theory. But I believe that God pulsated, in a sense, and these light beams twisted and came up in all places on this flat surface. And what that did is the light beams are crossing in all possible combinations, and that is generating people. Because if you look at our body, like look what I'm made of. I'm ultimately just a bunch of atoms, stuck together, which means that really what I am is a pattern. I am a certain ordering of atoms, right? If you got a bunch of atoms together and put them in the exact same order that my current atoms were in, I believe that that would be a copy of me. I believe that that being would, in a sense, have all of my thoughts and previous states of being. Now, where this kind of gets complicated, or a little bit more convoluted, you could say, is, well, how are we going to, is there an afterlife? Are we going to remember all of the lives that we've lived if ultimately we're just a pattern of information? But here's what I believe. Me and you and all of the conscious beings in the world, we basically have a divine spark within us. And this divine spark is on that flat sheet of light that is God. We are basically God, is what I'm saying. Now, we are not an evolved version of God. We are not the highest version of God, but we are constantly evolving towards ourself. We're constantly evolving towards a higher state of light that's being reflected off of this flat piece of God, this flat infinite light, and we are evolving towards ourselves. So what's funny is when we're praying to God, we're actually praying to a higher version of ourselves, asking for help, and that being that we're praying to could pray to a higher version of itself, because again, it can continue. God can continuously improve forever. And as this light is being projected up from this flat piece of light, basically it's going to go on forever, because all the light beams are crossing and creating infinite amount of patterns. And as more patterns are being generated, there's infinitely more possibilities of future patterns to be generated. So there's a higher and higher being always constantly being created. So that's what I believe is really going on here. And just to give further credence to this, in a way, when God is generating all of these, well, really God, the beginning and the end are basically the same thing. So God in the beginning being infinitely, being infinite despite only being a little, small piece of, light, was still infinite in that form. But then as it's reflecting, it's basically expanding the definition of itself. And you kind of see this, if you look at Shakespeare, I know this is a big twist, but stay with me here. If you look at Shakespeare, he wrote, "To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune." Shakespeare wrote that. It's one of his more famous plays. I think it was Hamlet. And what's funny about that is I believe that when you say something that is true for all conscious beings, when you create something that goes back to that initial form of God, because remember, God was also depressed in the beginning. In the beginning, when God was just this little ball, people would say, well, how could God possibly be depressed if God's an infinite being in the beginning? Well, God didn't have anyone to share it with. It was just he was infinitely alone, even though he was infinitely powerful. So basically, God realized that, all right, I have to trick myself by creating other beings. I have to trick myself into generating other beings who are not going to know that they're me. And the way this was done is there's a certain rotation where the future state perfectly encapsulates the prior state, but the future state doesn't know that it was also the prior state. So that's what I believe is going on. There's a certain twister, there's a certain tornado kind of spin, a certain rotation that causes this phenomena to where God can almost forget that he is, everybody, that we are everybody. You are me and I am you, So that's kind of what I think is going on here, is that God is really everybody. We are God. But we are evolving towards a higher version of ourselves, in a sense, right? That's why it's kind of funny, That's why like it's kind of funny when when you think about it, because, well, people say, well, what's the center of the universe? Well, the center of the universe is everywhere because it's infinite, you know? So you are the center of your own universe. I am the center of my own universe, and I can talk to God. Hey, God, please help me out. You know, you can pray, and you're really praying to you're really praying to yourself, a future version of yourself that you don't know yet because you're not there yet, you know? That's what I really believe. And if you think about it, this kind of ties into evolution in a way. This is the most loving way that the system could be. You know, what system could possibly be more loving than a system where if I help my fellow man, if I help somebody out, I'm really helping another version of myself. Now, whether I'm going to be that person or not in the future is unknown, because it depends on where you are in the evolutionary cycle, this infinite evolutionary cycle that we're all going through. But basically, it's an infinitely loving system. It's an infinitely intelligent system, because the more possibilities that are present, and the more intelligent the being becomes, the better that being can relate to its decisions in relationship to the entire system. So God, the highest version of God that currently is, although I believe God is constantly improving, I fight against the notion that God cannot improve. I disagree with that fundamentally. I believe God can continuously improve forever. That's what I personally believe, because I think, you know, any God that couldn't continuously improve, well, so you're saying you couldn't be better? That sounds kind of imperfect. Now, some people might say, well, I'm already perfect, but so you couldn't double in size? You know? That like it kind of becomes subjective almost. And in a way, perfection within God is subjective. But basically, that's what I believe is happening here, is that we are evolving towards ourselves. We are all God. All of the conscious beings are God. Really, everything is consciousness, because it all comes from this light that is basically a flat light that is reflecting upward. In a way, we're kind of like a painting made of light, in a sense, that is infinitely growing in complexity and understanding and love and relationships between the other parts of the system. And that's kind of what I believe is going on. So we are everybody. You know, you hear some people who say they've had past lives, and maybe that's possible because God can never really fully trick himself. This is where you get into the really kind of sad element of my version. God can never really fully forget that he's alone. You know, God can never really fully forget that, you know, no, I am all that is. You know, I'm God of everything, but I'm also God of nothing, in a sense, because everything I create is just more of me. You know, what is God made of? Well, God was made of whatever God was always made of. Therefore, God could only make more with the material he had, which was just himself. So that's why the pattern of information is necessary. God could not generate a new material. You know, God could not generate a new material from what he didn't have, which what he was made of is all that was, so that's all he had. And I say he just because that's the common language that I grew up on, but I kind of broke out of it. But this is my version of God, you know? This is what I think is really going on. We are God. Everything you're looking at is God. You can see infinite meaning in everything you look at. And essentially, there is always more patterns and more complexity being generated because God is always evolving towards, you know, a higher state. But there's infinitely more to go. It's never going to end. You know, this flat piece of light at the beginning, in a way, encapsulates every possible combination because it was the very, very ground floor of existence. But it by no means encapsulates it doesn't encapsulate the experience of being a higher being. You know, God can, the flat piece of light in the beginning is the generator of everything. However, it does not experience everything until it actually gets there. God is moving as fast as God possibly can within this developed framework of generating a new experience with a certain spin while still encapsulating the old experience so that it doesn't ever really fully forget. Because it can't forget because it's God. It has to be, you know, godlike, so to speak. So this is my version of God. This is kind of what I think's going on. We are God. We're infinitely alone. Hey, you know, sorry to depress you, but we're also infinitely loving and infinitely powerful and infinitely intelligent, you know, in the future. So, and we're getting more intelligent all the time. We're getting more loving all the time. Our ability to relate to other parts of the system is growing over time. So who knows, Maybe I'm onto something here, maybe not. We'll see. Make sure to hit the subscribe button down below.